Shalom. Welcome back to our series on Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. I'm Jonathan Reich, and we are closing in on the end of this. We're talking about Principle 12, which is the coming of the Messiah. Let's take a look at our liturgy before we do anything else. Ani Mamin. This is really famous. This is sort of the most famous part of Ani Mamin, and there are a lot of songs like this. But here you go. Ani Mamin be'amuna shlema beviat hamashiach ve'af al pi sheitmameh im al ken ze echake lo bechol yom shiavo. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, and even though he may delay, nevertheless, I will anticipate every day that he will come. There was a slogan of Jewish socialism at one point that was, while Messiah delays. The idea being that while we were waiting for the Messiah, we would try and perfect the world. Anyway, the Yigdal. Yishlach leketz yamin meshichenu liftot mechake ketz Yeshuato. He will send a Mashiach, a Messiah at the end of days, to redeem those who wait for the end, his salvation. So, those are confusing. Let's review a little bit about what Mashiach is. A Messiah. Mashiach literally means anointed, that is, anointed with oil. In Israelite society, the process of investing somebody with high office involved putting perfumed, scented, special consecrated oil on their head. This apparently derives from an Egyptian custom, but it was very important in Israelite society. So every priest was anointed with oil as their part of their investiture, and in particular, kings were anointed at their coronation as a way of signaling that they had divine imprimatur, divine approval to be king. So every king was Mashiach, was anointed, was a Messiah. This is also true of some foreign kings, most notably Cyrus of Persia, who in Isaiah chapter 45 is flat out called my anointed one by God in my Mashiach, my Messiah. But none of that is actually what is meant by Messiah in this context and Messianism in general. Messiah evolved, especially after the destruction of the temple, but before that, sort of after the heyday of Israelite kings was over, after the period where you had, even when you had Israelite kings, you had like the Maccabees and people like that who weren't in the mold of the great biblical kings of David and Solomon and Hezekiah and Josiah, and in particular were not part of the Davidic dynasty, to whom God had promised eternal reign on the throne of Israel. Once you had those people gone, you developed this idea that, well, since it was promised that their dynasty would reign eternally, they must be coming back. And that got folded in with the idea of future redemption, future return to glory and greatness. The idea that the Messiah, who would be an anointed king from the house of David, would usher in either a new era or return to an older era in which righteousness would reign, good kingship would reign, fidelity to God would be the rule of the day. And in some understandings of it, this got folded in and joined with apocalyptic beliefs. That is, that the enthronement of the Messiah would coincide with sort of a cosmic change from a period where good is not necessarily ascendant to one where good is ascendant, to one where justice would be sort of a more operative concept than it often seems to be. And you can imagine, this is obviously Christianity began as sort of a messianic movement and transformed very quickly into something else where the idea of Jesus as Messiah morphed from the idea of an earthly king sitting on the throne dispensing justice to a sort of more spiritual ruler, changing not the earthly order but the heavenly order. But from a Jewish perspective, that move never really got entirely made, and part of the Jewish objection to Jesus as a Messiah is precisely that this earthly kind of rule did not take place, and the establishment of a new Jewish kingdom and just rule, both among the people and over among the Israelite people and over other peoples, did not take place. So that's a problem there. Let's step back for a minute and talk about Messianism as part of these 13 principles, because this is different. This feels different from the previous ones, and that's also true of the next principle, the last one. Here, this is sort of a standalone, independent one. We've seen groupings before. We saw the first few, which are about the nature of God, and which sort of went from this overarching proof of the existence of a very abstract, distant kind of God, and talking about God's eternity and God's spirit, being a spirit rather than having any kind of physical body, and these very philosophical concepts about God. And then we sort of shifted to a bunch of ones where we would start with this very philosophical idea, like prophecy exists. That is, God could do prophecy if God wanted, and here's how it would look. And then it shifts down to this very historical thing. God made Moses a prophet, or Moses became a prophet and is the greatest one. And so, you have this very specific prophecy, which is the top prophecy. We have similarly, you go on and develop that um, and you have the idea of specifically that we have kept the Torah pure in its text, and then starting this big idea, God can have knowledge of people's individual behaviors, and that doesn't annul free will, and it also doesn't annul God's perfection or God's unity. And then that narrows down to God rewards mitzvot. Here, where this is sort of a standalone one, it's not related, at least directly, to any of the other ones, and it's not really a philosophical principle. It's a historical one, and it's justifying a Jewish doctrine which is very well established. The idea of a Messiah is something that's been part of Judaism for a long time, whether we like it or not. In our current days, the Reform movement has largely done away with the idea of an individual Messiah and prefers to talk about a messianic age. But still, can't entirely just say, that we don't want anything to do with that. They have to deal with the idea of messianism, even if it has to be reimagined, which is a perfectly fine thing to do. But in the same way, Maimonides, I think, I can't say that he doesn't want to have messianism, but I'm not sure he has a choice. And I'm not sure I think he thinks that you can't sort of fold it into any of the more philosophical beliefs, because it's really, how are you going to prove systematically that God picked out this dynasty, the House of David, to rule Israel and won't forsake that? I'm not sure you can. But I'm also not sure that you can ignore it. I think the Rambam is correct in that if you're making a list of Jewish principles, messianism has to be in there somewhere. And Jewish messianism has generally been hopeful, although in the rabbinic period it was really sort of pushed down because it was also often political and involved political upheaval. And so it was very dangerous. And there are a lot of statements in the Talmud to the effect of, don't be too into this, because every time someone's thought the Messiah was here, it hasn't happened, and it hasn't ended up going well. The Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans from 132 to 135 CE was a messianic revolt, supported by none other than Rabbi Akiva, who gave this name to the leader, Bar Kokhba, which means son of the star, and is a messianic sort of title. And in the end, the Jews got beat by the Romans, and things ended up being worse than they were before. That was sort of how things went. So Jews learned to kind of tamp down messianism, but it's always present in Jewish religious life, and no less so than here. It's interesting to see what Maimonides does with it, and we'll see this again in the next principle. Maimonides is, as you might suspect, not really into the supernatural. He's a scientist, he's a rationalist. He doesn't like the idea of things happening that are outside of the normal order. He certainly allows for it. You really can't be a religious thinker, or at least a biblically based thinker, and do otherwise. But he wants to downplay it. So the Messiah for him is not a supernatural figure. And we've already seen that he's explicitly said the Messiah is not a prophet, and certainly not, as some people have said, a prophet on the level of or even surpassing Moses. Nobody does that, and certainly not the Messiah. Let's take a look at what Maimonides himself says about this principle. The 12th principle is the belief in the days of the Messiah, to wit, the belief in and the assertion of the truth of his coming. He shall not be a long time, and if he tarries, wait for him. Habakkuk 2:3. No time for his coming may be set, nor may the verses of Scripture be interpreted to reveal the time of his coming. As our sages have said, may the wits of those who calculate the date of the end be addled. So that's another aspect of Messianism, is when is the Messiah going to come? And people have made all manner of predictions. In Christianity, it tends to take the shape of when will the Messiah return, but nevertheless, people have made very, very specific predictions about this based on a whole number of things, largely at some point scripturally based, and then often kind of going off the rails of that. And they've all been wrong. So again, there's a real caution in putting too much work into this. He's saying you have to believe in this. This is part of our belief. This is a thing which is going to happen, but it's going to happen, but we don't know when, and we don't exactly know how, and we certainly don't know who. So just sort of let it happen. It's not a belief that needs a lot of attention in that sense. In other places, when Rambam is talking about his messianism, in Mishneh Torah and the laws about kings and places like that, he's very explicit that this is just sort of what it sounds like. It's a guy from the house of David, from that dynasty, who is going to be crowned and rebuild the temple and reign in Jerusalem. But in the same way that, say, Solomon or Hezekiah or Josiah did. That is, he's going to be a good human king who is going to be an excellent and fair leader, a capable defender, certainly a just judge, but not divine, not having any special powers, not a prophet, not infallible, not anything beyond human. He's going to come and reign and reestablish the Davidic dynasty, and then he's going to die like everybody does, after living to a ripe old age, and presumably, and having great success and parenting children to carry on the dynasty. It's going to be a return to basically to biblical times, which were often, which were good. Things like the reign of Hezekiah, very successful, but not magical, not a transformation. Some people have imagined the Messianic era as a time of transformation of the order of the universe. Isaiah talks about the lion lying down with the lamb. Even the relationship between predator and prey will be fixed so that it won't have to be like that. That's not how Maimonides sees it. He sees it as basically a dynastic restoration, a restoration of political Jewish power in Jerusalem, a restoration of Israelite norms of things like the temple, but not essentially a change in the fundamental structure of reality or the world or the order of the world even. I think it's safe to say that what you have here is a belief which is has a long and important history as part of Judaism. And you have Maimonides not wanting to not wanting to deny it and not really able to deny it, but choosing instead to get out in front of it a little bit and cast it in a way that he's more comfortable with. He would not at all be comfortable with some people's concept of Messiah, ones which are more miraculous, one in which the Messiah has sort of religious powers. There's a real kind of separation of powers that goes on within the Israelite rulership, where there's the king and then there's the high priest, and prophets are sort of outside of that. So the king is usually not a prophet and can't be a priest, except for the Maccabees who did that, and that's why the rabbis hated them a lot. But Maimonides is sort of taking this messianic belief and casting it in a way that he's comfortable with, which is non-supernatural and not something to be really thought about. I mean, something to be waited for, hoped for, prayed for, expected. He expects that this will happen, but he doesn't know when. He says you can't know when. He says you shouldn't spend your time trying to figure out when. If it happens at a certain point, you'll know it, because the temple in Jerusalem will be rebuilt and this guy will be reigning as king. And it is a guy and a king. And then, then we'll know. And until then, there's not a lot you or I can do about it. So I think that he's casting in a more naturalistic, rational way something that some people have cast in a much more supernatural, miraculous, spiritual way. So summing up Rambam's 12th principle, there will be a Messiah. This is undeniable, and it's unacceptable to him to deny it. With that said, we don't know when this messianic period will commence, and it is both not allowed and also useless to try and figure it out. We will know when it happens because the temple will be rebuilt and a king from the house of David will be ruling in Jerusalem. So that will be pretty obvious. You won't be able to deny it at that point. This king will not be a prophet, will not be a priest, will not usher in any kind of new era of the condition of the world, but will be a good ruler. And we can all look forward to that. Not a bad thing, but Maimonides is very careful to remove any kind of supernatural or religious or spiritual aspect to this. That is, Judaism will be the same, essentially. It will be restored to Temple Judaism, and the kind of Judaism you have where you have a Jewish king reigning over the Jewish people from Jerusalem. But we've had that before. And there won't be anything different about it per se than from that time. But I'm down. I'll take it. So that's the 12th principle. Next time we will wrap this up and look at the 13th principle, which is the bodily resurrection of the dead. Shalom.